USS Texas, a World War I-era dreadnought, saw distinguished service in Africa and Europe during the Second World War, in Operation Torch, in the Allied landings at Normandy, and in the invasion of southern France that was called Operation Dragoon. But with the land war firmly established in Europe, Texas was sent for refit. But her service wasn't finished. In the Pacific War, the Allied strategy of island hopping required every naval gun available for shore bombardment of Japanese forces that were heavily entrenched. In early 1945, Texas arrived in the Pacific to aid in one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Codenamed Operation Detachment, Texas had arrived just in time to support the landings at Iwo Jima. By 1944, Allied forces were firmly on the offensive in the Pacific. Early in the war, Japan had succeeded in capturing a large number of islands in the Pacific, but fierce fighting had pushed them back, and the capture of the Mariana Islands provided a base for American B-29s to bomb the Japanese mainland. The next target was the island of Iwo Jima, about halfway between Japan and the Marianas. The Japanese were fully aware of how dire their situation had become. The Japanese had attempted to stop the invasion of the Marianas, which led to the carrier-based Battle of the Philippine Sea, dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The clash was the largest carrier battle in history, pitting 9 Japanese carriers against 15 Allied carriers. But the Allies smashed the Japanese air attacks, destroying hundreds of aircraft and sinking 3 carriers. The battle destroyed a large part of the Japanese' entire carrier-based air force, and losses in experienced pilots in this and earlier battles would haunt the Japanese for the rest of the war. When combined with the loss of much of the Japanese surface fleet in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the Japanese were left unable to respond to continued Allied advances in the Pacific. By the end of 1944, it was clear to the Japanese command that they could not stop the Allied onslaught. Japanese forces could be isolated, and the Japanese Air Force and Navy lacked the ability to contest Allied landings. American B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese mainland from the Marianas bases, but faced a long and difficult flight home. Crews of damaged B-29s were often forced to ditch in the ocean, and there was no friendly base between the Marianas and Japan. Iwo Jima was the most significant base lying alongside the route. The value of Iwo Jima was recognized well before an invasion was planned. While still battling in the Marianas in July of 1944, General Hap Arnold had recommended an attack on the island. Curtis LeMay said that Iwo Jima would be of tremendous value as a staging field, as an emergency landing field for B-29s in distress, as a base for air-sea rescue, and a base for fighter escorts. He underlined the island's value by saying that without Iwo Jima, I couldn't bomb Japan effectively. When Premier General Hideki Tojo put Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kobayashi in charge of the island's defenses, he told him that the entire army and nation will depend upon you for the defense of that key island. It was Kobayashi who ordered the construction of the island's underground tunnel defenses. After the war, Japanese officers described the defense strategy as an effort to gain time necessary for the preparation of the homeland defense, checking the enemy by delaying tactics. The effort was dubbed Operation Detachment, and Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, was put in charge. American bombers targeted Iwo Jima by August of 1944, and by September were bombing the island in 20 raids or more a month. Planning the invasion, General Harry Schmidt, commander of the Marine Landing Force, requested 10 days of a bombardment by a cruiser division and 3 battleships, but the Navy refused the request, as well as another request for 9 days of bombardment. The Navy believed that the originally planned 3 days of bombardment would be enough. Beginning December 8th, for 10 weeks, Iwo Jima was hit by bombing runs nearly every day. In that time, there were several naval bombardments, firing 203 rounds of 16-inch, 6,400 rounds of 8-inch, and more than 15,000 rounds of 5-inch shells. American planners expected no unusual difficulty in taking Iwo Jima. The Japanese had been building up defenses on Iwo Jima since March of 1944. Defenses up to 90 feet deep in the volcanic rock of the island were dug. Tanks for water and gas were installed, and reinforcements were sent, until about 21,000 Japanese were dug in on the island. Despite the large bombardment in the weeks leading up to the attack, the deep defenses remained largely intact. Kobayashi kept his forces mostly back from the beach, in light of the naval and aerial advantage of the American forces. The USS Texas served extensively in the European theater before moving to the Pacific. supporting amphibious landings during Operation Torch, the landings at Normandy, and Operation Dragoon in southern France. She left the Mediterranean in September 1944 and stopped in New York for a 36-day repair period. By Christmas, she had passed through the Panama Canal, was moored in Hawaii. She joined American forces at Ulithi Atoll, a major staging base built in the last months of 1944 by Seabees. On February 10th, Texas departed Ulithi to begin pre-invasion rehearsals, in company with the McKinley-class amphibious force command ship USS Estes, the flagship of Task Force 52, the amphibious support task force, along with the battleship Arkansas and numerous other ships. Texas participated in simulating firing on February 12th and 13th. As part of Task Force 54, Texas arrived off Iwo Jima on February 15th, 4 days before the invasion. Task Force 54, the gunfire and covering force, included 6 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 16 destroyers. On February 16th, pre-landing bombardment began. At 7 that morning, Texas spotted Mount Suribachi through low clouds. Poor weather obscured the island, and at 7:05, Texas launched one of her 2 spotting planes, OS-2U Kingfishers. Weather soon delayed scheduled firing due to low visibility, caused by heavy mist over the island, and a very low ceiling, which limited the operations of spotting aircraft. According to Texas's action report, all ships were ordered to withhold their fire until targets were definitely sighted, and then to fire only at long and medium ranges. Firing finally commenced at 8:02. 5 salvos were fired over the next 12 minutes, before visibility again prevented the Kingfisher from spotting targets. Weather continued to hinder naval bombardment throughout the day. 3 salvos were fired between 9:02 and 9:06, and the main battery fired again at 10:45. Aboard the Texas, the guns of Turret 2 were briefly halted after a round exploded prematurely, only 1,000 yards from the ship. But no defects in the guns were found, and investigators decided the failure was due to a defective fuse. At 2:11, Texas spotter plane reported that a Zero made one run on him. Kingfisher spotter planes were massively outclassed by Zeros, but the pilot was able to avoid the Japanese plane and return fire. Finally, in the afternoon, the weather cleared enough to allow Texas to spend most of 3 hours firing on the island. Ultimately, on the first day of bombardment, Texas fired 124 rounds of 14-inch ammunition, reported 3 cave entrances and 1 artillery emplacement destroyed. The following day, the weather remained poor. In the afternoon, the Texas closed to 2,000 yards for close fire support. The veteran crews fired 242 rounds of 14-inch shell and 439 rounds of 5-inch shell on the second day. Reported hits on multiple pillboxes, anti-aircraft guns, and personnel shelters. 2 hits were reported on a personnel concentration, with several casualties observed. The careful defense preparations became apparent when landing underwater demolition teams, at least a dozen landing craft were damaged by shore batteries, and the destroyer USS Lutz, covering them, was hit as well, with 6 casualties, including seriously injuring the commanding officer, Commander Burton Roberts, Jr. The little landing craft were inundated with fire from shore, and several retreated, only to be replaced by others. 152 men were wounded, 44 killed, but the boat stayed until they recovered the frogmen. The commanding officer, boat 449, was awarded the Medal of Honor. The same day, the cruiser Pensacola was hit 6 times as she covered minesweepers near shore. 17 men were killed and another 119 wounded. On February 18th, the Texas was ordered to bombard the guns that were thought to have fired those shots. Mist continued to cover the island, but Texas opened fire at 7:30, fired on and off at that target and others throughout the day. In all, 195 rounds of 14-inch and 207 of 5-inch were fired. Texas reported 3 guns destroyed, along with several anti-aircraft guns and a radar control station. As for the guns that fired on Pensacola, they were silenced, but destructive effects on them not determined. During the day, one of Texas's Kingfishers was sent on a rescue mission for a pilot downed 100 miles southeast of Suribachi. The Kingfisher rescued a downed pilot. During the bombardment, the ship's chaplain, Lieutenant L.A. Dickinson, used a public address system like a sports commentator, keeping men below decks appraised of the events above. After 3 days of sporadic bombardment, February 19th was D-Day for the Marine landings on Iwo Jima. Weather had seriously hampered naval and aerial bombardment during that period. Major General Henry Schmidt, commander of the landing force, complained that we only got about 13 hours worth of firing support during the 34 hours of available daylight. Air support had been limited as well, as most of the planes had been involved in missions bombing the Japanese mainland. February 19th, in contrast to the previous days of poor weather, was clear and bright. and Marines began landing at 8:59. Texas began firing at 6:50 that morning, and carrier planes also made a bombing run before the landing. On the day of the landing, Texas fired another 270 rounds of 14-inch and 167 rounds of 5-inch rounds. Texas stayed on mission for 2 more weeks, standing by to provide fire support to Marines on shore. On February 23rd, the ship reported sighting the flag raising on top of Mount Suribachi. On March 7th, Texas joined with other ships to return to Ulithi to prepare for Operation Iceberg, the landing at Okinawa. In total, Texas had fired 923 rounds of 14-inch shells and 829 rounds of 5-inch shells during her time supporting the Iwo Jima landings. Texas escaped unscathed. However, the escort carrier Bismarck C was sunk by kamikaze attacks, killing 318. This Bismarck C was the last U.S. carrier to be sunk in the Pacific War. The carrier Saratoga was also badly damaged. The landings at Iwo Jima were heavily contested, and it wasn't until March 26th, after 5 weeks of fighting, that the island was officially declared secure. The terrible cost, 26,000 Marine casualties, including 6,800 dead, has long led to questions on the strategic value of the entire operation. In April 1945, retired Chief of Naval Operations William Pratt criticized the expenditure of manpower to acquire a small, godforsaken island, useless to the Army as a staging base and useless to the Navy as a fleet base. Air strategy changed during the time it took to secure the island, and daylight precision bombing gave way to nighttime fire bombings, which made Iwo Jima less important as a base for fighter escorts. The Japanese mainland continued to receive early warning of bomber runs from other islands. One author records that 1,191 fighter escorts and over 3,000 strike sorties were launched from Iwo Jima, and that 2,251 landings were made by B-29s. The first B-29 to make an emergency landing at Iwo Jima landed even before the battle was over on March 4th. However, most of the B-29 landings were not emergency in nature. More than 80% of the landings during May, June, and July 1945 were merely for fueling. The pre-landing bombardment has been criticized for not being long or significant enough, although some has questioned whether more bombardment would have helped. Reporter Robert Sherrod said that on Iwo, the enemy dug themselves in so deeply that all the explosives in the world could hardly have reached them. USS Texas went on to support the Allied landings at Okinawa, her last combat assignment. She returned to the Philippines in May and remained there until the Japanese capitulation on August 15th. Battleship Texas is now being restored in dry dock at Gulf Copper in Galveston, Texas. Battleship Texas Foundation could not restore and maintain Battleship Texas without the generous support of donors like yourself. Find out more at battleshiptexas.org. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.